A woman's car broke down during the worst blizzard in years. She was completely stranded until James, a quiet local mechanic, braved the storm to help. When he saw her military ID, his hands started trembling. By morning, a Blackhawk helicopter would land outside his garage. Hi everyone, welcome to Story Karma. Let's get started. For 15 years, Matthews Auto Repair had been the last stop before 30 miles of nothing on Route 16. When James Matthews returned from Afghanistan with a face reconstructed from shrapnel wounds, most locals had been too polite to ask questions. They just accepted the quiet mechanic with the scarred hands and distant eyes, grateful for his honest prices and willingness to tow stranded motorists day or night. The garage had been his father's before the cancer took him, and James had slipped into the role like putting on an old coat. It didn't quite fit anymore, but it was better than facing the emptiness. Most days, he could almost convince himself this had always been his life, that the nightmares of desert heat and artillery fire were just bad dreams, not memories. Tonight, winter had come early to northern Montana, bringing the season's first blizzard. Snow fell in thick curtains, transforming the landscape into something alien and hostile. James had been about to close up when the emergency line rang. "Matthews Auto," he answered, already reaching for his coat. "Please help," a woman's voice came through, tight with barely controlled panic. "My car died about 5 miles east of town. I'm stuck in the storm." "I'll be there in 20, James said. "Stay in your vehicle. Run the engine for 10 minutes every half hour to keep warm." "Any landmarks nearby?" "A big billboard for Pine Valley Resort," she replied. "Got it. Hang tight." James fired up the heavy-duty tow truck, its chains already fitted for winter conditions. The wipers struggled against the snow as he navigated the increasingly treacherous roads. The Weather Service had warned this storm could drop 2 feet by morning. Anyone stranded out here was facing serious danger. The truck's headlights caught the reflective paint of the Pine Valley billboard, and just beyond it, the hazard lights of a sedan blinking weakly through the snow. James pulled the tow truck alongside and stepped out into the biting wind, snow immediately working its way down his collar. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a woman in her 30s with short dark hair. Her face was composed, but James recognized the look in her eyes, controlled fear, the kind soldiers got when they were determined not to show panic. "Car just died," he called over the wind. She nodded. "Completely. No warning, nothing." "Let me take a look." "You should wait in my truck. Heater's running." She hesitated only briefly before grabbing a backpack and making a dash for the tow truck's passenger side. James popped the hood of her sedan and aimed his flashlight into the engine compartment. Even in these conditions, he could tell this wasn't a simple fix. The timing belt had snapped, likely causing cascading damage to the engine valves. This car wasn't going anywhere tonight. Back in the truck, the woman had her hands pressed against the heating vents. Her shoulders were rigid with tension, but her face remained calm, the disciplined composure of someone trained to handle emergencies. "Timing belt's gone," James informed her. "Need to tow it back to the shop." "I'm James Matthews." "Alexis Kelly," she replied. "Thanks for coming out in this. I was beginning to think I'd be spending the night out here." James put the truck in gear. Not a good night for that. Temperatures dropping fast. As they drove, James noted her precise movements, the way she scanned their surroundings, her habit of checking her watch, all military traits he recognized from his own time in service. "You passing through?" he asked. "Heading to Helena for a job interview," she said. "Should have checked the weather more carefully before setting out. Montana storms come quick this time of year." Alexis nodded, then looked out the window at the worsening conditions. "Any hotels in town?" "Just Pine Valley Motel. Nothing fancy, but it's clean. I know the owner, they'll have a room even without a reservation." Back at the garage, James worked efficiently to unhook her car and get it into a service bay. Alexis stood to the side, watching his movements with a professional eye that caught every detail. "Can I see some ID for the paperwork?" James asked, reaching for his clipboard. Alexis opened her wallet and handed him her driver's license. As he wrote down the information, a military ID card slipped out and fell to the floor. James picked it up automatically, then froze as he read the name, Captain Alexis A. Kelly, M.D., U.S. Army Medical Corps. His hands began to tremble. Memories crashed over him like artillery fire, the searing pain, the taste of blood and sand, the struggle to breathe through a shattered face, and above him, a female medic working frantically to keep him alive, her voice steady amid chaos. "Stay with me, Marine. Not letting you check out on my watch." The dog tags she pressed. Her dog tags into his hand before the medevac took him away. "Return these when you're back on your feet, Matthews." "That's in order." Those dog tags now hung around his neck beneath his shirt, where they had remained every day for the last 10 years. "For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." "Something wrong?" Alexis asked, noticing his reaction. James swallowed hard, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Just Army Medical Corps. I was in Afghanistan. Marines." Alexis's expression shifted subtly. "I was there too. 2 tours." James handed back her IDs, careful not to stare at her too long. She wouldn't recognize him, not with his rebuilt face, the titanium plates beneath his skin, the carefully reconstructed features that resembled his old self but weren't quite right, like a painting that captured the essence but missed the details. "Your car needs serious work," he said, trying to sound normal. "Parts won't come till after the storm. Probably looking at 3 days minimum." Alexis sighed. "Perfect timing. My interview's in 2 days. I can give you a ride to Helena when the road's clear," James offered. "Should be passable by tomorrow afternoon if the forecast holds." "I appreciate that." Alexis glanced at her watch again. "Guess I should get to that motel before the storm gets worse." James nodded. "I'll drive you. Just need to lock up." As they headed to the motel, the storm intensified, snow swirling around the truck in white vortices that made it nearly impossible to see the road. James drove with the focused concentration of someone used to navigating difficult conditions, both environmental and personal. "You said Marines," Alexis asked suddenly. "When were you in Afghanistan?" 2010 to 2013, James replied, eyes fixed on the road. "Helmand Province, mostly." Alexis was quiet for a moment. "I was there in 2013. Field Surgical Unit near Songin." James' knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Songin. The place where he'd nearly died, where Alexis Kelly had saved his life. "Rough deployment?" he asked, knowing the answer. "The worst," she admitted. "Lost too many. Saved some too." But she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. James knew exactly what she meant, how the ones you couldn't save haunted you more than the ones you did. The Pine Valley Motel appeared through the curtain of snow, its vacancy sign flickering in the storm. James parked as close to the office as possible. "I'll make sure they've got the room," he said. 10 minutes later, Alexis was checked in, and James had carried her bag to a modest but clean room at the end of the building. "Breakfast starts at 6, he told her. "I'll come by around noon tomorrow to check on road conditions." "Thank you, James," Alexis said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "For everything." James nodded and turned to leave. "Matthews?" she called after him. He froze, his back to her. Had she recognized him? "Stay safe driving back," she finished. "Will do, Captain," he replied automatically, then cursed himself silently for the slip as he headed back to his truck. That night, James barely slept. The storm raged outside his small apartment above the garage, but the real turbulence was in his mind. Should he tell her? Would she even remember him, just one Marine among hundreds she treated? And if she did, what then? He pulled out the dog tags he'd carried for a decade, running his thumb over the embossed letters, Kelly, Alexis A. Pulowski. Morning brought clear skies but roads buried under nearly 2 feet of snow. The plows would be working all day to clear the main routes. Helena was still unreachable. James was opening the garage when his phone rang. Matthews Auto, he answered. James, it's Alexis Kelly. Just checking on the roads to Helena. Still closed, he replied. Highway department says late afternoon at the earliest. Alexis sighed. I've tried rescheduling my interview, but they're not being flexible. Might lose my shot at this job. What kind of job? James asked before he could stop himself. Emergency medicine. Helena General. There was a pause. It would be my first medical position since I lost my license. The admission surprised him. Lost your license? Another pause. It's a long story. Involves a patient, a panic attack, and a medical board with no sympathy for PTSD. James' chest tightened. He knew all too well how the battlefield could follow you home, ambush you when you least expected it. I'm heading to Miller's Diner for lunch, he said. Best food in town. Could pick you up if you want to get out of that room for a while. 30 minutes later, they sat in a booth at Miller's, the diner surprisingly busy with locals swapping storm stories. Betty Miller herself brought their coffee, eyeing Alexis with the undisguised curiosity of a small-town resident encountering someone new. Friend of yours, James? She asked, filling their cups. Customer? James replied. Car trouble. Betty nodded sympathetically. Picked the wrong day to break down, honey, but you're in good hands with James. Best mechanic in 3 counties. After she left, Alexis studied him over her coffee. Not much for conversation, are you? James shrugged. Never been good with words. Military men rarely are, she replied with a small smile. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that develops between people who understand that some experiences don't need to be articulated to be shared. When they finished, Alexis seemed reluctant to return to her motel room. Your garage open today? She asked. Wouldn't mind seeing what you're dealing with on my car. Back at the shop, Alexis watched as James began the process of removing her car's damaged engine components. Her medical training made her appreciate his methodical approach, the precision of his movements despite hands marked by old injuries. Those scars, she said suddenly. Shrapnel? James paused, then nodded. 2013. Songin. Alexis went very still. I was stationed at the field hospital there. April through November. August 15th, James said quietly. That's when I got hit. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but then confusion. She was trying to reconcile the man before her with memories of wounded Marines from a decade ago. You treat a lot of facial reconstructions? He asked. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. Too many, she admitted. Why? James set down his tools and straightened up. You saved one Marine's life. Shrapnel had torn apart half his face. Medics in the field had given up on him, but you refused to. You worked on him for 7 hours. Alexis's face paled. How could you possibly know that? James reached beneath his collar and pulled out the dog tags. Because you gave him these. Told him to return them when he was back on his feet. His voice grew thick. That was me, Captain Kelly. Alexis stared at the dog tags, then at his face, her medical training allowing her to see past the reconstruction to what had been there before. Matthews, she whispered. Sergeant James Matthews. They told me you died during evac. James shook his head. Came close. Woke up 2 weeks later in Germany. Spent the next 2 years in and out of surgery. He gestured to his face. New model, but same engine underneath. Alexis reached out tentatively, her fingers stopping just short of touching his scarred cheek. I've thought about you for years. You were the one that broke me. Broke you? Her hand fell away. After they told me you died, something changed. I started second-guessing every decision, became obsessed with the idea I'd missed something, done something wrong. She looked down. 3 years later, I froze during an emergency surgery back home. Patient nearly died. Review board pulled my license. James felt a wave of guilt. I'm sorry. If I'd known they told you I died. It wasn't your fault, Alexis interrupted. "The system failed both of us." They stood in silence, two survivors connected by a single violent day neither could forget. "You kept my tags all this time?" she finally asked. James nodded. "Reminded me I got a second chance. That someone fought for me when others gave up." Alexis's professional composure cracked, tears filled her eyes. "I needed to hear that. Especially now." "Your interview in Helena," James said. "It's for getting your license reinstated? Probationary position. Last chance to prove I can still practice medicine." She wiped her eyes. "And I'm going to miss it because of this storm." James thought for a moment. "Maybe not. Let me make a call." He stepped outside, phone pressed to his ear. Alexis could see him talking intently, nodding occasionally. When he returned, there was new determination in his expression. "Pack your things," he said. "We leave in 30 minutes. "The roads?" "Not taking roads. Friend of mine flies search and rescue helicopter. Can get you to Helena in under an hour." Her eyes widened. "You'd do that for me? You saved my life, Captain. Least I can do is return the favor." 2 hours later, Alexis was in Helena with enough time to prepare for her interview. James returned to his garage, the quiet settling around him like the snow outside. He'd given her his number, told her to call when she was done, but he didn't expect to hear from her again. People moved on, that's how life worked. That evening, as he was closing up, his phone rang. "Got the job," Alexis's voice came through, triumph mixed with disbelief. 6-month probationary period, but it's a start. "Congratulations, Doc. You earned it. I'm staying in Helena tonight, but I'll need a ride back to get my car tomorrow. And James, thank you for everything. Just returning the favor." After they hung up, James sat in the quiet garage, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, purpose beyond just getting through each day. The next morning, James drove to Helena to pick up Alexis. The 4-hour round trip gave them time to really talk about the war, about their struggles afterward, about finding meaning in civilian life. By the time they returned to his garage, a strange sort of friendship had formed, built on shared trauma and mutual respect. "Should have your car ready by Thursday," James told her as they pulled up, "assuming the parts arrive tomorrow." "No rush," Alexis replied. "I don't start for 2 weeks. Thought I might stick around, get to know the area better." She hesitated. "If there's a decent place to stay." James heard himself say, "My father's old house is sitting empty. Been meaning to rent it out. But it's furnished." For the next week, Alexis became a fixture at the garage. She brought lunch, asked questions about the repairs, even handed him tools occasionally. The locals noticed, of course, in a town this small, nothing went unremarked. Betty from the diner winked at him whenever he came in, and old man Peterson actually slapped him on the back and said, "About time, son." But it wasn't like that. They were two people who understood each other's wounds, who didn't need to explain the nightmares or the hypervigilance or the way certain sounds made their hearts race. Being around Alexis made James feel normal for the first time in years. Friday evening, as they sat on his porch watching the sunset, Alexis asked the question he'd been dreading. "Why didn't you tell me who you were right away?" James considered his answer carefully. "Wasn't sure you'd remember me. And if you did, wasn't sure I wanted to be someone's bad memory." Alexis shook her head. "You were never the bad memory, James. Believing I failed you, that was the bad memory. You didn't fail. I'm sitting right here because of you. And I'm sitting here because of you," she replied. Funny how things work out. The weekend passed quietly. They shared meals, swapped stories, and gradually filled in the 10-year gap in their connected lives. "I start at Helena General in 9 days," Alexis said finally. "It's only an hour's drive from here." James nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. "My father's house needs a tenant," he replied. "Long term, if you're interested." Alexis smiled. "I might be." Throughout the weekend, James noticed Alexis making several hushed phone calls, stepping outside when her phone rang with no caller ID. When he asked, she'd simply say, just tying up loose ends. Sunday evening, as they shared dinner at the local diner, Betty Miller stopped by their table, excitement barely contained. "James Matthews, what on earth is going on? Sheriff just told me government vehicles have been asking directions to your garage. Said they had government plates. Military types." James looked at Alexis, who suddenly seemed very interested in her coffee. "No idea," he replied, though a strange tension had settled between his shoulder blades, the old combat awareness he hadn't felt in years. That night, he caught Alexis sending emails with attachments labeled Matthews 35 sang. She closed her laptop when she noticed him. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," she replied, a mysterious smile playing on her lips. "You'll see." Monday morning dawned clear and cold. James was opening the garage when he felt at first a rhythmic vibration that traveled up through the concrete floor and into the soles of his boots, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a decade but would never forget. The distinctive whump-whump-whump of rotor blades cutting through air. Not just any helicopter. A Blackhawk. James stepped outside, a mixture of confusion and instinctive alertness washing over him. The sound grew louder, echoing off the mountains. Then he saw it, the unmistakable silhouette against the morning sky, heading directly toward his garage. The Blackhawk circled once, then landed in the empty field across from his garage. Even more surprising were the 3 military vehicles that pulled up just as the helicopter touched down. Men and women in Marine dress uniforms began to emerge, first a handful, then a dozen, then more. They formed into neat rows, standing at attention as an older officer with a chest full of medals walked toward James. "Sergeant Matthews?" the officer called. "Yes, sir," James replied automatically, his body instinctively straightening. "Colonel Michael Haynes, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Your old unit." The colonel extended his hand. "We've been looking for you for quite some time." James shook his hand, confused. "I don't understand, sir. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." Captain Kelly contacted us. Told us she'd found the Marine everyone assumed had died en route to Germany. The colonel smiled. "We don't leave our people behind, Matthews. Not even the ones who disappear into civilian life." By now, nearly 50 Marines stood at attention in front of the garage. James noticed Alexis standing off to the side, watching with a mix of emotion. "What is this?" James asked. "This is long overdue," Colonel Haynes said, producing a small box from his pocket. "The Purple Heart you never received. And this," he held up a second, larger box, "is the Navy Cross that was awarded posthumously. Seems we need to correct the record." James stared at the medals, speechless. "The official ceremony is this afternoon. Your fellow Marines insisted on being here. Some traveled from across the country overnight." James looked at the assembled Marines, recognizing a few faces despite the years. These were his brothers and sisters in arms, the people he thought he'd left behind. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, Sergeant," the colonel replied. "Just know that what you did that day in Songin, dragging 3 wounded Marines to safety after you'd been hit, it wasn't forgotten. And neither were you. Stand still that afternoon." Everyone closed their businesses to witness the ceremony in the town square. James stood uncomfortably in his old dress uniform, still a perfect fit after all these years, as Colonel Haynes recounted his actions in Afghanistan. After the explosion, despite catastrophic facial injuries and shrapnel wounds to his chest and legs, Sergeant Matthews returned to the burning vehicle 3 times, extracting wounded Marines while under enemy fire. Only after confirming all his men were clear did he finally allow medics to treat him. By then, he had lost over 40% of his blood volume. James hadn't remembered it that way. In his nightmares, he was always too slow, too late. But as he looked at the 3 Marines standing in the front row, the men he'd pulled out that day, he realized that some memories could be rewritten. After pinning on the medals, Colonel Haynes stepped back. "Sergeant Matthews didn't just save lives that day. According to Captain Alexis Kelly, who treated him at the field hospital, his actions inspired her to develop new protocols for facial trauma that have since saved dozens more. Alexis stepped forward then, no longer in civilian clothes but in her army dress uniform, captain's bars gleaming in the sunlight. "Sergeant Matthews didn't know it," she said, addressing the crowd, "but his case became the foundation for my research in battlefield facial reconstruction. The techniques we pioneered while treating him are now standard protocol in combat hospitals worldwide." She turned to face James directly. "You never stopped saving lives, Sergeant, even when you thought you were just a mechanic in Montana." That evening, after the Marines had returned to their base and the town had finally stopped taking pictures and shaking his hand, James and Alexis sat alone on his porch again. The medals sat on the table between them, still in their cases. "Why did you do it?" James asked. "Contact my old unit? Arrange all this?" Alexis looked out at the darkening sky. "Because 10 years ago, they told me I'd failed to save you. That my patient had died despite everything I'd done." She met his eyes. "Finding out you were alive, that I hadn't failed, it gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "Your confidence as a doctor?" "My purpose," she corrected. "Same as you gave these people today." She gestured toward the town. They never knew who was really living among them. A hero who thought he was just a mechanic. James shook his head. "I'm not." "Don't say you're not a hero, James," Alexis interrupted. "I've sewn enough of them back together to know one when I see one." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear overhead. "I start at Helena General in 9 days, Alexis said finally. "It's only an hour's drive from here." James nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. "My father's house needs a tenant," he replied. "Long term, if you're interested." Alexis smiled. "I might be." The next morning, James opened the garage to find a line of vehicles waiting for service, more than he'd seen in years. Word had spread about the decorated Marine mechanic, and suddenly everyone wanted their car fixed by him. As he began working on the first vehicle, he caught sight of Alexis watching from the doorway of the office, coffee in hand, a look of satisfaction on her face. Some wounds never fully heal. Some battles never really end. But sometimes, finding the right person to fight alongside you makes all the difference. And sometimes, the most important rescue happens years after the battlefield is left behind. Love this story? Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Don't forget to check out the video currently on your screen, you won't want to miss it. See you in the next one.